When Declan raised his glass in the home I had anchored for 25 years, he assumed his rehearsed speech would finish us. He relied on the shock and the presence of our two grown children to paralyze me while he stole the house, the business, and our history. He expected tears when he finally said, "I am leaving you for another woman." Instead, I simply opened the leather folder I had prepared 10 months ago. My name is Avery Parker. I am 47 years old, and for the better part of 2 decades, this renovated farmhouse just outside Columbus, Ohio, has been the center of my universe. As I stood in the kitchen on the afternoon of our 25th wedding anniversary, I looked around at a room that was essentially a museum of a marriage I had once believed to be indestructible. Every object, every architectural choice, carried the weight of our history. The reclaimed barn wood beams across the ceiling were installed the year Declan finally turned a profit at the firm. The massive copper farmhouse sink was my gift to myself after I spent 3 grueling months untangling a mess with our primary suppliers. I knew the grooves in the white oak flooring. I knew exactly which floorboard near the pantry creaked, a sound I had tiptoed over 1,000 times when the children were infants. I was standing at the wide marble island, my hands moving through the familiar, rhythmic motions of preparing our anniversary dinner. I had planned the menu meticulously, executing it with the quiet precision of a surgeon. In the heavy enameled Dutch oven on the stove, the beef short ribs had been slow cooking in red wine and herbs for 6 hours, filling the house with a rich, savory warmth. Next to the stove, a pot of water boiled aggressively for the potatoes, which I would soon mash and whip with browned butter. On the counter, a bright, peppery arugula salad waited to be tossed in a sharp lemon vinaigrette. And resting on a wire cooling rack by the window was a perfect blood orange tart. The edges of the pastry were golden and crisp, the center a deep, jewel-toned crimson. Years ago, when we were still struggling to pay the mortgage, I baked that exact tart for Declan's birthday. He had closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and told me that it was the smell of family. Today, I baked it not out of love, but because I needed every prop on this stage to be flawlessly in place. The heavy front door swung open, bringing a rush of crisp Ohio autumn air into the hallway. Willa arrived first. She is 24 now, a force of nature navigating her way through her second year of law school. She dropped her oversized leather tote bag onto the entryway bench with a familiar, heavy thud. "Something smells absolutely incredible in here," Willa called out, her voice echoing down the hallway. A moment later, Jude walked in behind her. He is 22, an engineering student who has always possessed a quieter, more observant demeanor than his sister. He shoved his hands into the pockets of his denim jacket, offering me a small, easy smile. "Hey, Mom," Jude said, walking straight toward the kitchen island. He reached out, attempting to pinch a loose flake of crust from the edge of the tart. "Do not even think about it," I said, gently swatting his hand away with a wooden spoon. "That is for later." "Dad is going to eat half of it anyway," Jude laughed, stepping back and leaning against the counter. Willa poured herself a glass of water, leaning in to kiss my cheek. The atmosphere in the kitchen instantly transformed into a comforting, chaotic hum. This was our family ritual. For 25 years, I had cultivated this warmth, this safe harbor against the rest of the world. It felt entirely normal, completely authentic. Yet, beneath my calm exterior, my heart was beating with a slow, heavy rhythm. My phone vibrated against the marble countertop. I wiped my hands on a linen towel and picked it up. It was a text message from Declan. "Running late. Be there in about 20 minutes. Go ahead and pour the drinks." I stared at the glowing screen. The phrasing was perfectly polite, yet entirely devoid of affection. It was the kind of clinical, distant language a project manager might use to update a casual acquaintance. He was acting out a script, pushing through the final scenes of a play he was desperate to finish. I locked the phone and set it face down on the counter. What Declan did not know, what Willa and Jude standing just feet away from me did not know, was that I had been aware of his secret for 10 long months. 10 months of breathing the same air, sleeping in the same bed, and smiling across the same kitchen island. 10 months of waking up every morning and choosing not to scream. The knowledge had settled into my bones like a cold draft, but it had not broken me. Instead, it had sharpened me. "Is Dad almost here?" Willa asked, noticing my silence. "He is running about 20 minutes behind," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "Traffic on the interstate, I imagine." The wait stretched out. The house began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like the terrifying, dead stillness that settles over a landscape right before a violent storm breaks. Everything around me was beautiful. Everything was orderly. The silver was polished. The cloth napkins were sharply folded on the dining table. The lighting was dimmed to a soft, amber glow. But the perfection was too deliberate. It was a stage set waiting for its final act to begin. Finally, the gravel crunched in the driveway. A car door slammed. The front door opened and closed with a soft click. Declan stepped into the foyer. I watched him from the kitchen threshold. He was wearing his tailored charcoal suit, the expensive one he usually reserved for courting new investors. My eyes immediately dropped to his right hand. He was holding a sleek, dark bottle of champagne by the neck. The label caught the light, revealing a vintage French brand of ridiculous expense. Declan was a bourbon and craft beer man. He possessed no knowledge of fine champagne and would never have selected that bottle on his own. It was a gift chosen by someone else, someone who read high-end lifestyle magazines and had very expensive, very specific tastes. I looked at his left arm. His heavy wool overcoat was not hung neatly on the brass hooks in the mudroom, where it had belonged for a decade. Instead, it was slung casually over his forearm. It was the posture of a man who was preparing to leave, not a man who was coming home. He walked into the kitchen, his eyes scanning the room but never quite settling on anything. He looked at the walls, the island, the children, and finally at me, as if he were a tourist visiting a museum he had outgrown. He stepped forward and leaned in to kiss my cheek. His lips were dry and cool, a hollow gesture completely devoid of familiarity or heat. "You made the tart," Declan said, his voice strangely flat as he looked at the wire rack. "I did," I said. "It is our 25th anniversary. I wanted everything to be perfect." He offered a tight, uncomfortable nod, setting the champagne down on the counter as if it were a heavy burden. He rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes darting toward the dining room. Willa and Jude were already carrying the salad bowls to the table, their quiet laughter drifting back to us. Declan took a deep breath, smoothing the front of his suit jacket. His shoulders squared, and I saw the familiar, polished mask of the corporate leader slide over his face. "Before we all sit down and get started with the food," Declan said, raising his voice just enough to carry into the dining room, "I need to say a few words first. Could everyone gather in the living room for a moment?" Willa and Jude exchanged a curious glance, setting down their bowls and walking back toward the center of the house. I wiped my hands on the linen towel one last time, folding it neatly and placing it beside the sink. I looked at the slow-cooked beef, the browned butter, the vibrant orange tart, the smell of family. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. I looked at my husband, the man who believed he was about to blindside a helpless housewife. The moment I had spent 10 months preparing for had finally arrived. I smoothed my dress, stepped out of the kitchen, and walked calmly toward the living room to watch him burn his own house to the ground. The air in the dining room turned to solid ice the moment we took our seats. We had migrated from the living room at his insistence, abandoning the carefully prepared meal in the kitchen. The four of us sat around the long mahogany table, the unlit beeswax candles standing between us like silent sentinels. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Declan sat at the head of the table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He did not look like a man about to destroy his family. He looked like a man preparing to lead a third-quarter earnings call. "I asked you all to sit down because there is no easy way to do this, and I do not believe in dragging things out," Declan began, his voice devoid of any tremor. He looked directly at me, but his eyes were entirely blank. Avery, I am ending this marriage. I am in love with another woman. Her name is Sloane Mercer. The words dropped onto the polished wood table with the brutal, heavy thud of a physical blow. The suffocating silence that followed was so absolute, I could hear the blood rushing in my own ears. He did not beat around the bush. He did not offer a gentle prelude. He delivered the executioner's stroke with terrifying efficiency. I glanced at my children. Willa was sitting completely frozen. The color drained from her face so rapidly I thought she might lose consciousness. Her hand, which had been resting on the stem of her water glass, trembled violently before she pulled it back into her lap. Jude did not move a single muscle. He stared straight ahead at the empty linen placemat in front of him. His jaw was clenched so tightly the muscles in his cheek twitched. He was retreating deep into his own mind, violently trying to force order onto a reality that had just shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. I know this is a shock, Declan continued, shifting his gaze to Willa and Jude, adopting the soothing, reasonable tone of a mediator. I chose to tell you all tonight, together, because I believe in being completely honest. There is no right time for this kind of news, but hiding it, pretending for another day, would be hypocritical. I want us to handle this in a civilized manner. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting gently on my lap. I gave him nothing, no tears, no screaming, not even a question. I simply watched him. I understood his strategy with crystal clarity. He had chosen our anniversary dinner. He had chosen to do this in front of our grown children, because he calculated that the sheer humiliation and shock would paralyze me. He believed I would be too desperate to maintain my dignity in front of Willa and Jude to cause a scene. He was using our children as human shields to ensure a clean, quiet getaway. The truth is, Declan said, leaning back slightly in his chair, attempting to frame himself as the brave realist in the room. This marriage has been dead for a long time. We have just been going through the motions. I am finally taking the difficult step to stop pretending. I am choosing to live my truth. And eventually, I hope you all understand that it is for the best. Living his truth. The corporate buzzwords of modern betrayal rolled off his tongue effortlessly. He was rewriting 25 years of shared history, erasing my contributions, my loyalty, and my love, to justify his departure. He wanted to be the hero of his own exit strategy. I have already met with my attorney, he stated, his tone shifting from philosophical to logistical. The transition was jarring, revealing his true priorities. I want a swift, clean divorce, Avery. We are going to have to list this house immediately. I cannot maintain two households, and the equity here is the most logical way to fund the separation. He gestured vaguely at the hand-hewn beams and the custom wainscoting I had painstakingly designed. He was dismissing the sanctuary I had built as nothing more than a liquid asset to be cashed out to fund his new life. Furthermore, he pressed on, his pace quickening now that he was entirely focused on the money. Hawthorne Ridge Restoration is currently under severe cash flow pressure. The market is incredibly volatile right now. To avoid awkwardness and protect everyone involved, my lawyer has drafted separation agreements that we need to execute quickly. It is imperative that we untangle our assets immediately before the business liabilities complicate the divorce proceedings. There it was, the ultimate maneuver. He was weaponizing the stress of the business to force me into signing away my rights. He was trying to panic me into a corner, banking on the assumption that a terrified, grieving housewife would blindly sign whatever documents he pushed across the table just to make the nightmare end. He assumed I knew nothing about the true state of our finances. He assumed I was entirely dependent on his narrative. He finally stopped talking. The suffocating weight in the room settled heavily on my shoulders. I looked at his face. For a fleeting second, his confident facade slipped. A tiny furrow appeared between his eyebrows. He had expected hysteria. He had braced himself for tears, for begging, for a dramatic explosion he could point to and say that my emotional instability was exactly why he had to leave. My absolute, terrifying calm was throwing him off his rhythm. I was not reacting. I was simply observing him, dissecting his lies one by one in the quiet sanctuary of my own mind. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Unsure of how to navigate the void I was offering him, he still believed it was just temporary shock, a delayed reaction before the inevitable breakdown. He thought he had successfully cornered his prey. I slowly reached to my left, from the empty chair beside me. I picked up the thin, black leather folder I had retrieved from my home office safe earlier that afternoon. I brought it up and placed it gently onto the center of the mahogany table. The soft slap of the leather against the wood echoed loudly in the silent room. I picked up my neatly folded linen napkin and set it down beside the folder. I looked directly into Declan's eyes, allowing the cold, hard truth of the past 10 months to finally rise to the surface. "Thank you for finally choosing to tell the truth," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the sharp, cutting edge of a razor. "Now it is my turn." My realization did not arrive in a dramatic cloud of cheap perfume lingering on a jacket lapel, nor did it manifest as a smudge of crimson lipstick on a carelessly discarded shirt collar. The unraveling of my marriage began precisely 10 months ago, on a remarkably mundane Tuesday morning, in the form of an automated electronic invoice. It was sent to a legacy administrative email address I had established when we first launched Hawthorne Ridge Restoration. It was an inbox Declan had completely forgotten, still routed directly to my primary secure server. The subject line read simply, "Your guest receipt." I opened the attachment while sipping my morning coffee. It was an itemized bill from a boutique luxury hotel in Sedona, Arizona. The total charge was $4,890 for a 3-night stay, complete with couples deep tissue massages, private room service dining, and premium alcohol charges. The payment method listed at the very bottom of the document was the company's primary corporate credit card. A lesser woman might have printed the receipt, marched down to the company headquarters, and thrown it in his face. I did not. I sat in the absolute quiet of my kitchen, feeling a strange, freezing calm wash over my entire body. I finished my coffee, walked into my home office, and locked the door behind me. I bypassed his recently changed passwords using a master administrator backdoor I had programmed into our network infrastructure a decade prior. I pulled up our enterprise accounting software. I ignored the sanitized, top-level profit and loss statements he usually presented to the bank and dove straight into the raw, unfiltered vendor disbursements. It took me less than 2 hours to find the parasite attached to our livelihood. The vendor name was Mercer Brand Advisory. It was a profile added to our system exactly 14 months prior. A quick search of state business registries confirmed it was a single-member limited liability company registered to a woman named Sloan Mercer. The payments began as a modest $3,000 a month, labeled vaguely in our ledger as marketing outreach. 6 months later, the monthly disbursements jumped dramatically to $12,500, reclassified under a new expense code for strategic consulting and brand alignment. Declan never truly understood accounting. He viewed ledgers as annoying bureaucratic hurdles managed by people less visionary than himself. I, however, had built our original bookkeeping system from the ground up. I knew the architecture of our finances intimately. Looking at the screen, I recognized the clumsy, heavy-handed way he was trying to bury the money. He was nesting Sloan's exorbitant consulting fees inside the larger budgets of our ongoing residential builds, artificially inflating the overhead costs of legitimate projects to camouflage the steady drain on our cash reserves. Sitting in the dark glow of my monitor, the true, terrifying scope of his betrayal crystallized. The physical infidelity was entirely pedestrian, a tired cliché of a middle-aged man chasing his lost youth. The financial architecture he was building in the shadows, however, was something entirely different. It was predatory. Declan was deliberately bleeding the company's operating capital. He was intentionally engineering a fictitious liquidity crisis, His strategy was brutally clear. He intended to siphon our shared wealth into Sloane's accounts, artificially crash the valuation of Hawthorne Ridge restoration, and when the time eventually came to demand a divorce, leave me holding half of a financially crippled entity while insisting we sell the farmhouse to cover the manufactured debts. He was preparing to push all the structural risk onto me while he walked away clean. I did not confront him when he came home that evening. I served him dinner and listened to him complain about supply chain delays with a perfectly steady pulse. The next morning, I did not call a therapist to cry about my broken heart. Instead, I drove downtown and walked into the offices of the most ruthless corporate litigator in Columbus. Through his network, I retained a formidable family law attorney and a private forensic accountant. I handed them encrypted drives containing full access to our servers. I instructed the accountant to initiate a quiet, comprehensive, forensic audit of the last 36 months of our business operations. While the accountant traced the digital trail of the money, I went down to the basement to reconstruct the paper history. I unlocked the heavy, fireproof filing cabinet tucked into the darkest corner of the storage room. I bypassed the recent tax returns and the current active vendor files, digging all the way to the very back. I pulled out a thick, slightly yellowed manila envelope labeled with the year 2009. I sat on the cold concrete floor and opened the file. The smell of old paper instantly transported me back to the worst year of our lives. That year, the global housing market collapsed, and the secondary shockwaves nearly destroyed us. Hawthorne Ridge restoration was on the brink of absolute insolvency. We had massive payroll obligations to meet, angry subcontractors threatening to file liens against our properties, and zero incoming revenue. Declan was entirely paralyzed by the panic, unable to make a single coherent decision. It was my money that saved us. I took $350,000, the absolute entirety of the inheritance my late father had left me, and injected it directly into the failing business accounts to keep the lights on and the crews paid. I pulled the foundational documents from the envelope. At the time of the cash injection, our attorney had drafted a strict amendment to our operating agreement to formalize the rescue, in exchange for relinquishing my personal financial safety net to save his dream. My ownership stake was fundamentally restructured. The amendment explicitly stated that my capital contribution translated directly into 52% of the company's voting rights. It granted me the ultimate, overriding authority regarding the management and direction of the firm. I flipped to the final page. Declan had signed his name on the dotted line in blue ink, his signature shaky with relief. Over the intervening 17 years, as the economy recovered and the business eventually flourished into a highly profitable enterprise, Declan became the charismatic, public face of the company. He shook hands with local politicians, he gave lengthy interviews to regional architectural magazines, and he stood on active job sites in a pristine hard hat, pointing aggressively at blueprints for the cameras. He told the story of his self-made, visionary success so many times that he actually began to believe it himself. He convinced himself that he was the sole architect of our wealth, the unquestioned, absolute king of the empire. I never bothered to correct him. I preferred to stay in the quiet background, meticulously managing the complicated supplier contracts, balancing the operational risks, and allowing his fragile ego to grow completely unchecked. Because he never had to deal with the consequences of his own administrative negligence. He forgot the paperwork in the basement existed. He forgot the mechanics of how his own company was structured. Most importantly, he forgot who truly held the keys to the kingdom. Holding that damp, heavy document in the silence of the basement, the last lingering traces of my grief evaporated. The pain of the romantic rejection was permanently replaced by a cold, crystalline sense of purpose. My objective was no longer tied to the desperate hope of saving a dead marriage. I had zero interest in messy, emotional vengeance. My mission was entirely tactical. I was going to protect the farmhouse I had spent decades turning into a sanctuary. I was going to secure the financial stability of the 42 dedicated employees who depended on our payroll to feed their own families. I was going to trap my husband inside the exact financial cage he was currently attempting to build around me. I spent the next 10 months living a flawless lie, smiling across the breakfast table, sleeping next to a thief, and silently arranging the pieces on the board. I was simply waiting for him to make the first move, knowing I already held the mechanism that would lock the door behind him forever. I am not the tragic, weeping cliché of a betrayed housewife. Society loves the narrative of the devoted woman who sacrifices her entire identity to iron her husband's shirts and raise his children, only to be left standing empty-handed and bewildered in the rain when he inevitably trades her in for a newer model. That was never my story. When Willa and Jude were finally old enough to navigate their own daily schedules, I did not join a local country club or spend my afternoons tending to a greenhouse. Instead, I quietly re-entered the professional sphere. I took a part-time position that rapidly evolved into a senior contract advisory role for North Basin Facilities Group, a highly successful privately held infrastructure firm. My work at North Basin was not glamorous, but it was incredibly powerful. I spent my days analyzing hundreds of pages of dense legal text. I dissected indemnification clauses, negotiated force majeure parameters, and evaluated default terms for massive commercial developments. I learned, with absolute certainty, how a single poorly defined word in a legally binding document could shift millions of dollars of liability and entirely alter the destiny of a company. More importantly, this career provided me with my own independent, substantial income. I maintained a pristine personal credit score. I was not a dependent waiting for an allowance. I had my own income, my own credit, and my own financial footing. For nearly 2 decades, my sharp legal eye was the invisible shield protecting Hawthorne Ridge restoration. Declan was the charismatic visionary. He adored the applause. He loved standing in front of half-finished luxury properties, wearing a pristine white hard hat, and giving expansive interviews to regional architectural magazines. He possessed a natural talent for making wealthy clients feel like they were participating in a grand artistic endeavor. I gladly let him stand in the spotlight because I recognized early on that true power does not require an audience. While Declan was out shaking hands and selling the dream, I was in the back office managing the brutal reality. I was the one who ruthlessly negotiated with our lumber and steel suppliers when global supply chains fractured. I was the one who processed the endless, complicated change orders that kept our margins from collapsing. I was the one who maintained a calm, steady relationship with our commercial bankers, smoothing over the panic every time Declan impulsively committed us to a project that was significantly larger than our actual operational capacity. Over time, I simply stopped attending the groundbreaking ceremonies and the industry galas. I grew entirely exhausted by the endless parade of arrogant men who only wanted to hear other men talk about success. Declan made a fatal miscalculation. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my absence. He assumed that because I had stepped back from the front lines, I had surrendered my authority. He believed that out of sight meant out of control. He failed to realize that the person who controls the ledger controls the entire empire. This dangerous arrogance became blatantly obvious when I discovered the preliminary term sheets for a new, highly volatile project he was secretly trying to acquire. It was a massive waterfront redevelopment called Mariners Row. It was an incredibly aggressive mixed-use commercial and luxury residential undertaking, completely outside our normal scope of operations. Reading through the initial engineering reports I pulled from his digital files, I immediately spotted the fatal flaws. The soil composition along the riverbank was unstable, requiring deep, wildly expensive foundational pilings that would obliterate the projected profit margins. The local zoning board was notoriously hostile to the proposed density variances. It was a vanity project, an ego-driven monument that Declan desperately wanted to build to solidify his legacy. To secure the preliminary financing for Mariners Row, the commercial lenders were demanding astronomical capital commitments. They required personal guarantees that went far beyond the assets of the business. I stared at a drafted letter of intent on my monitor, my blood running cold. The lenders were demanding additional collateral to offset the extreme risk. Declan was preparing to leverage the equity in our renovated farmhouse. He was willing to risk the roof over my head to finance his ego. As I dug deeper into his private correspondence with his external legal counsel, the true depth of his malice revealed itself. He was not merely making a reckless business decision, he was actively constructing a narrative to insulate himself from the inevitable fallout. I found drafts of memorandums and emails where he was deliberately planting seeds of doubt regarding my competence. He explicitly described me to his lawyers as a spouse who had entirely lost touch with the complex operational realities of the modern construction industry. His strategy was chillingly transparent. He knew Mariners Row was a massive gamble. If the project imploded and dragged the entire company into bankruptcy, he was laying the foundational paperwork to ensure I would be the designated scapegoat. He was preparing to argue that my supposed negligence in the back office was the true cause of the financial failure, leaving me to shoulder the legal and financial ruin while he walked away with his new life. I did not panic or break anything. I went straight to work, using the same cold precision I brought to North Basin every day. I opened an encrypted directory on my laptop and began preserving evidence. I exported the raw server logs, pulled the metadata, and downloaded the routing records for every digital signature, cross-checking each timestamp against his unauthorized approvals. By the time I was done, his chaos had become a clean, airtight timeline that any corporate lawyer or judge could understand in under 20 minutes. To execute my counteroffensive, I knew I needed to secure the perimeter. I needed absolute certainty regarding the board's voting dynamics. I reached out to Leland Voss. Leland was a shrewd, old-school industrialist who held a 10% minority stake in our firm. He was a man who respected cold ledgers vastly more than warm charisma. We met for a quiet, discreet lunch at a dimly lit steakhouse on the south side of the city. I did not mention the impending divorce. I did not utter Sloan Mercer's name. I kept the conversation strictly focused on the structural integrity of the business. I slid a heavily redacted, one-page summary of the Mariners Row risk profile across the white tablecloth. Leland adjusted his reading glasses and studied the numbers in absolute silence. When he finally looked up, his pale blue eyes were razor-sharp. Declan is pushing for a wildly aggressive expansion here. Avery, Leland said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. The exposure on this riverfront property is borderline catastrophic. Are you comfortable with this direction? I am currently evaluating the complete risk profile. Leland, I replied, holding his gaze without blinking. My only priority is ensuring the foundational integrity of this firm remains intact. I need to know that when the time comes to make a definitive decision regarding the company's exposure, you and I are looking at the same reality. Leland slowly folded the paper and slipped it into the breast pocket of his tailored suit. A faint, knowing smile touched the corners of his mouth. He did not need me to spell it out. Leland remembered exactly what happened in the dark days of 2009. He remembered exactly whose personal capital had dragged the firm back from the edge of oblivion. He knew perfectly well who actually kept the engine running, and it was not the man giving speeches in the hard hat. You have always protected our interests, Avery, Leland said quietly, signaling the waiter for the check. When you call the vote, you will have my proxy. Just tell me where to stand. Driving home that afternoon, the final piece of the psychological puzzle snapped into place. The deeper I excavated Declan's digital footprint, the more profound my clarity became. This was never simply about an affair. The younger woman, the expensive hotel rooms, the cowardly text messages, they were all just symptoms of a much larger, darker disease. Declan was not just betraying our marriage vows. He was executing a systematic, calculated attempt to erase my very existence from the history of our shared success. He wanted to rewrite the past 25 years, casting himself as the sole genius and me as the burdensome anchor holding him back. He intended to claim the entire empire we had built together, burn the evidence of my grueling labor, and walk away with the spoils. He thought he was outsmarting a tired housewife. He had no idea he was stepping into the arena with a woman who wrote the contracts that governed his life. I knew that confronting Declan prematurely would be the greatest tactical error of my life. If I had thrown a glass of wine in his face the moment I discovered his transgressions, he would have instantly recognized his exposure. He would have panicked, ordered the servers wiped, shredded the physical ledgers, and accelerated the offshore transfer of our remaining liquidity. I needed him to feel entirely secure in his arrogance. I needed him to believe his carefully constructed narrative was working flawlessly. The ultimate power of a trap lies entirely in the victim walking into it of their own free will, completely blind to the steel jaws resting just beneath the leaves. My corporate litigator, a man who viewed emotion as a severe liability in the boardroom, advised me to strictly categorize my intelligence. I spent my quiet evenings painstakingly building two entirely separate evidentiary tracks. The first track was the emotional betrayal. It contained the flight logs, the intercepted text messages, and the undeniable proof of his physical relationship with Sloane. It was the file that would effortlessly win me a moral victory in a divorce court. But the second track was the lethal one. That file contained the indisputable evidence of self-dealing, corporate malfeasance, and the gross misappropriation of Hawthorne Ridge restoration funds. I separated the cheating husband from the corrupt business partner, sitting in a high-rise conference room overlooking downtown Columbus. My attorney walked me through the specific mechanisms of our operating agreement. He pointed a silver pen at a dense paragraph regarding member rights. There was a highly specific clause governing the removal of a managing member. If the acting manager could be proven to have abused his fiduciary duties for personal enrichment, the majority shareholder possessed the unilateral right to demand an immediate vote of removal. Because of the exact wording we had finalized back in 2009. My 52% voting block meant I did not just have the power to call the emergency meeting. I had the power to act as the sole deciding vote. I did not need his permission to fire him from his own company. Before I could spring the trap, I still had to neutralize the immediate threat to the farmhouse. I scheduled a private, unrecorded telephone call with our primary commercial lending officer at the regional bank. I did not offer pleasantries about the weather or ask about his golf game. I asked him a direct, unyielding question. Has my husband approached you to leverage our residential property to secure the Mariners Row financing? I asked, my tone leaving absolutely no room for evasion. The line went completely silent for a long, heavy moment. Finally, the banker cleared his throat, his voice tight with sudden anxiety. He made an informal inquiry regarding the equity parameters. Yes, the banker admitted. I did not raise my voice. I simply informed the lending officer that any further movement on that inquiry would be considered an act of gross fraud. I instructed him to place an immediate, hard lock on the deed. I mandated that absolutely no liens, secondary mortgages, or credit extensions could be attached to the farmhouse without my physical, notarized signature applied in his direct presence, accompanied by a verbal authorization. The perimeter was secured. Declan could not touch the roof over my head to fund his disastrous vanity project. The most chilling discovery came 3 weeks before our anniversary dinner, while auditing a deeply buried subfolder on the shared network. I unearthed a draft of a member resolution. It was a formal legal document stating that I explicitly authorized the Mariners Row expansion. Furthermore, it contained aggressive language stipulating that I agreed to subordinate my own equity and personally assume the financial liabilities if the commercial loans went into default. It was a death warrant for my financial future. The document was dated 4 months prior, but the digital ink looked suspicious. Through an independent IT consultant, I had retained under a strict non-disclosure agreement. I pulled the hidden file metadata. The consultant confirmed my suspicion with absolute certainty. The file had not been created 4 months ago. It was generated on Declan's personal laptop at exactly 12:43 in the morning, a mere 3 weeks prior. He had maliciously backdated a legally binding resolution. He was simply waiting for the right moment, likely the chaos of the impending divorce announcement, to slip it into a stack of routine paperwork for me to blindly sign. It was not just poor judgment, it was premeditated financial sabotage. The architecture of my counterattack was finally complete. I drafted a formal notice calling for an emergency meeting of the company members. The stated purpose of the meeting was the immediate suspension of the managing member due to severe fiduciary breaches and documented self-dealing. I set the effective time for the notice to legally deploy at precisely 8:15 on the evening of our 25th anniversary. I chose that exact moment because I knew Declan's predictable, self-centered rhythm. By 8:15, he would have delivered his rehearsed speech. He would have demanded the divorce and laid out his cruel terms, believing he had won the war before I even knew a battle was happening. I did not stop at a piece of paper. I spent the afternoon of our anniversary quietly logging into the administrative portals of our banking institutions and our enterprise software, utilizing the master access I had retained since the founding of the company. I pre-programmed a series of automated command scripts. The moment the clock struck 8:15, the system would execute a silent, invisible cascade of lockouts. Declan's digital signature privileges would be instantly revoked. His access to the corporate credit lines would be frozen solid. His administrative passwords would be scrambled into meaningless code. He was going to sit at my dining room table and boldly declare his independence, completely unaware that he was simultaneously being locked out of the very empire he thought he controlled. The execution of this strategy required a level of emotional detachment that terrified me. The absolute hardest part of the entire 10 months was the profound silence I had to maintain with Willa and Jude. Every time Willa called to chat excitedly about her law school classes, every time Jude stopped by the house to raid the refrigerator and talk about his engineering exams, my heart fractured a little more. I desperately wanted to warn them. I wanted to pull them aside, hold their hands, and tell them that the foundation of our family was an illusion, and that a massive, destructive earthquake was coming to tear our lives apart. But I could not make them complicit in my war. If I told them the truth beforehand, I would be forcing them to carry an incredibly toxic secret. I would be asking my own children to sit at a celebratory dinner and put on a theatrical performance for a man who was actively trying to destroy their mother. They did not deserve that terrible burden. Furthermore, from a purely strategic standpoint, I needed their reactions at that table to be entirely genuine. When Declan dropped the bomb, I needed him to see their raw, unvarnished horror. I needed him to witness the exact moment their respect for him evaporated. I needed him to realize that he was not just cleanly divorcing a wife and stealing a company. He was permanently, irrevocably fracturing the way his children viewed him as a man. It was the only way the consequences of his actions would truly register in his mind. I had to let him break their hearts, so I could show them exactly how to survive it. I unclasped the brass lock of the thin leather folder. The sharp metallic click severed the heavy silence in the dining room. I did not raise my voice, nor did I allow a single tear to well in my eyes. I reached inside and withdrew 3 distinct, meticulously organized stacks of paper, placing them side by side on the polished mahogany surface between us. "I am not interested in debating morality with you tonight," I began, my tone as level and dispassionate as if I were reading a weather report. "We are not going to discuss broken vows, or loyalty, or the emotional devastation you assumed would render me speechless. You brought up asset division and cash flow pressure. We will stick exclusively to those topics." Declan stared at the papers, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. The script he had memorized did not account for administrative pushback. I tapped the first stack of documents with my index finger. "This is the complete, unredacted operating agreement for Hawthorne Ridge Restoration. I suggest you turn to the appendix drafted in the fall of 2009. You seem to have suffered a prolonged bout of amnesia regarding the structural ownership of the firm you claim to run." He blinked, the arrogant posture he had maintained since walking through the front door faltering slightly. "When I liquidated my entire inheritance to save this enterprise from total insolvency," I continued, holding his gaze with absolute authority. "That capital injection was not a marital gift. It was an equity purchase. That appendix, which bears your notarized signature on every single page, explicitly states that my contribution converted immediately into a 52% voting majority. I am not your passive dependent. I am the controlling shareholder of the company. You work for me. The color began to drain from his face, leaving a sickly, ashen pallor in its wake. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound materialized. I moved my hand to the second, thicker stack of paper. This is a comprehensive forensic accounting summary, finalized yesterday afternoon. I have been fully aware of your relationship with Sloan Mercer since early spring. I did not hire a private investigator to take grainy photographs of you holding hands at a restaurant. I hired a financial auditor. I watched his eyes dart toward Willa and Jude, suddenly realizing that the children he had intended to use as shields were now his audience for a public execution. This summary, I said, my voice cutting through the room like a scalpel, details exactly how you have been funding your new life. It chronicles every first-class flight, every luxury hotel suite, every piece of jewelry, and every expensive dinner. More importantly, it outlines the exact mechanism you utilized to siphon corporate funds into a fictitious consulting entity registered to your mistress. You have been actively draining the operating capital of my company to manufacture the very liquidity crisis you just attempted to use as leverage against me. That is an absurd fabrication, Declan finally stammered, his voice cracking under the sudden, immense pressure. He tried to project righteous indignation, but his hands were trembling against the edge of the table. You are hysterical. You do not understand the marketing budgets. I understand embezzlement, I replied seamlessly, denying him even an inch of breathing room. And I understand risk management, which brings us to your latest architectural fantasy. I leaned forward slightly, closing the physical distance between us. I am fully aware of the Mariners Row project. I know about the unstable soil reports, the hostile zoning board, and the catastrophic collateral demands from the commercial lenders. I also know that you attempted to initiate a secondary mortgage on this farmhouse to secure the preliminary financing. His jaw snapped shut. The fight evaporated from his eyes, replaced by the hollow, wide-eyed stare of a man plummeting from a great height. I spoke with the senior lending officer on Tuesday, I informed him, delivering the next strike with rhythmic precision. The bank has been fully briefed on the situation. The deed to this property is locked. You cannot leverage a single dime of equity from my sanctuary to patch the holes in your sinking ship. This house is completely out of your reach. The room was so quiet, I could hear the distinct sound of Willa taking a sharp, shallow breath. I did not look at her. My focus remained entirely locked on the man sitting at the head of the table. Finally, I placed my hand flat on the third and final document. It was a single sheet of heavy bond paper, printed with absolute formal clarity. I slid it slowly across the mahogany table until it rested directly in front of his empty dinner plate. You requested a civilized transition, I said softly. I am providing one. This is a formal notice of an emergency meeting of the corporate members, based on the indisputable evidence of self-dealing, fiduciary breach, and the gross misappropriation of company funds. Your authority as the managing member is officially suspended pending a final vote. I glanced up at the grandfather clock standing in the hallway shadows. As of 8:15 this evening, I stated, the finality of the words echoing off the walls. Your digital signature privileges have been revoked. Your access to all corporate banking portals is frozen. You have zero authority to bind the company, sign a contract, or authorize a payment. You are entirely stripped of your power. Declan sat paralyzed in his chair. The man who had walked into this house believing he was an unstoppable force of nature was now a hollow shell. He had spent his entire drive home preparing to discard a fragile, panicked woman. He was completely unprepared to face a corporate adversary who had been silently dismantling his life for nearly a year. He looked down at the single sheet of paper, his eyes scanning the stark legal language. Finally comprehending the absolute totality of his defeat, I allowed the silence to stretch out, giving the sheer weight of the documents time to crush whatever remaining defiance he harbored. To my right, Willa shifted in her chair. I briefly broke my gaze from Declan to look at my daughter. The profound shock that had paralyzed her just 10 minutes ago had vanished. She was not crying. She was looking at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was a mixture of absolute awe and deep, sudden comprehension for her entire life. She had watched her father take the bows while I managed the staging. In that single moment, the illusion shattered. She was not looking at a victim. She was looking at the architect who had secretly kept the entire structure from collapsing. Recognizing the fierce, silent intellect that everyone in this family had simply taken for granted. Then, the most extraordinary thing happened. Jude, who had remained perfectly still and silent throughout the entire ordeal, placed his hands flat on the table and slowly pushed his chair back. The scraping of the wood against the floor sounded like a thunderclap. He stood up, towering over his father. His posture was rigid. His young face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. "If you came here to blow up this family and keep the business too, you misread Mom," Jude said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a heavy, resonant gravity that commanded the entire room. Declan flinched as if he had been physically struck. He looked up at his son, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, desperately searching for a charm offensive that no longer existed. He had nothing left to sell, and no one left in the room willing to buy it. "Get your things," Jude commanded, gesturing toward the front hallway. Declan looked at me one last time. There was no apology in his eyes, only the terrified realization of his own ruin. He awkwardly pushed himself up from the table, his movements stiff and uncoordinated. He reached out with a trembling hand and gathered the 3 stacks of paper I had placed before him. He slid them into his own leather briefcase, zipping it shut with a pathetic, metallic rasp. He turned and walked toward the foyer. He did not retrieve his expensive wool overcoat. He did not look back. The heavy front door opened, letting in a brief gust of the cold autumn night, and then clicked shut behind him. He had walked in with a rehearsed speech and a plan for total victory. He was forced out carrying nothing but the meticulously documented blueprints of his own destruction. The dining room table was cleared, but the actual war had only just begun. My counterstrike had successfully obliterated the tidy exit script my husband had spent nearly a year writing, but it also dragged our private collapse into the harsh, public daylight. The fallout within the walls of our farmhouse was immediate and profoundly different for each of my children. Willa was consumed by a blinding, white-hot fury. Within 24 hours, she had blocked his phone number, packed away every photograph of him in her bedroom, and declared her intention to legally sever all ties. She wanted to burn his memory to the ground. Jude, conversely, retreated into a heavy, suffocating silence. He spent 4 consecutive days locked in his room or taking long, aimless drives in the middle of the night. His pain was quieter, but ran much deeper. He was wrestling not just with the loss of his father, but with the crushing shame of realizing the betrayal had been calculated over hundreds of days right in front of him. I made a conscious, deliberate choice not to turn the farmhouse into a militarized zone. I did not encourage Willa's rage, nor did I demand Jude articulate his grief before he was ready. I explicitly told them both that they were not required to pick a side. I refused to use them as pawns on a chessboard. Maintaining that boundary required every ounce of discipline I possessed. But keeping our home a sanctuary of peace was the only way I could prove to them that our family had not died that night. Only his role in it had. While I held the line at home, the atmosphere at Hawthorne Ridge Restoration was rapidly deteriorating into panic. By Monday morning, wild rumors were tearing through the office and the active job sites. The prevailing gossip was that a bitter, vindictive wife was staging a hostile, irrational coup against her husband during a messy divorce, because he had spent 15 years positioning himself as the undisputed visionary of the firm. A significant portion of the staff was terrified. They assumed the company would instantly collapse without its charismatic frontman. I knew I had to cauterize the panic before it infected our client base. On Wednesday afternoon, I called an all-hands meeting for the management team, the foreman, and the senior administrative staff. We gathered not in the polished corporate boardroom, but out on the concrete floor of our primary storage warehouse, surrounded by stacks of premium lumber and heavy machinery. I stood on a wooden pallet to ensure I could make eye contact with every single person in the room. I did not wear a corporate suit. I wore a simple sweater and jeans, presenting myself not as a conquering executive, but as the foundational steward of their livelihoods. "I know what the rumors are," I began, pitching my voice to be heard clearly over the hum of the warehouse ventilation. "I know many of you are concerned about the stability of your positions, given the sudden absence of our managing member. I am here to give you absolute clarity." I held up a thick, bound folder. "Every single payroll account is fully funded and secure. Every active residential and commercial contract remains legally binding and operational. Our vendor credit lines are open and functioning under my direct authorization. We are not pausing operations. No one is losing their job, their health insurance, or their quarterly bonuses because of a personal scandal at the executive level. The foundation of this company is cash flow and skilled labor, not public relations, and I control the cash flow." A palpable wave of relief washed over the warehouse floor. Shoulders dropped, jaws unclenched. It was in that exact moment that the tide truly turned. An older project manager named Marcus, a man who had been with us since the brutal recession of 2009, crossed his arms and looked around at the younger staff. "I remember the dark days," Marcus said, his voice gruff and loud. "I remember who actually answered the phone when the suppliers threatened to cut us off. It was never the guy in the glossy magazines. It was always you. You fix the messes. We work for the person who signs the checks. And as far as I'm concerned, nothing of value was lost this week." The quiet murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. The illusion he had spent years crafting vanished into the warehouse air. They finally understood that the man who took the credit was gone. But the woman who actually kept the lights on was standing right in front of them. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Sloane Mercer was experiencing her own brutal awakening. She had spent months believing she was the chosen victor in a high-stakes romantic drama. She thought she was stepping into a life of effortless luxury, bankrolled by a wealthy, powerful industry titan who was finally shedding his burdensome past. Instead, she woke up to find herself tethered to a man whose corporate credit cards were declining at local coffee shops. Through my legal counsel, I learned that her consulting payments had bounced dramatically on the first of the month. The lavish expense accounts were frozen solid. She was suddenly trapped in an expensive downtown apartment with a man who possessed no legal access to his own fortune. A man who had lied to her about his ownership stake, his liquid assets, and his ability to control the narrative. The glamorous fantasy he sold her was evaporating, replaced by the terrifying reality of incoming subpoenas and frozen assets. Cornered and desperate, my husband lashed out. He hired a famously aggressive, theatrical divorce attorney known for turning proceedings into chaotic media spectacles. Their opening strategy was entirely predictable. They filed a barrage of aggressive motions, attempting to paint me as a deeply disturbed, scheming woman who had spent a year hoarding documents to execute a vindictive, illegal corporate hijacking. They tried to argue that my 52% voting right was a technicality that should be invalidated due to emotional malice. It was a loud, aggressive legal performance, but it was entirely hollow. It failed to gain any traction with the judge or the commercial mediators, because professionals who understand high-level business do not care about emotional smear campaigns. They care about paper trails. My forensic accountant had constructed an impenetrable fortress of data. The opposing counsel could scream about my supposed malice all day, but they could not erase the digital timestamps of his unauthorized wire transfers, nor could they unsign the backdated resolutions he had fabricated. The ledgers spoke louder than their insults, but the true turning point of the week, the discovery that shifted the entire landscape of the war, happened late Thursday night. I was sitting at my kitchen island, reviewing the deeper architectural filings for the Mariners Row project that I had extracted from his hidden server. I was looking for any remaining financial liabilities connected to the business, as I cross-referenced the municipal zoning permits with the proposed secondary financing agreements. A terrifying pattern began to emerge. The documents were not just reckless, they were meticulously structured with a very specific legal architecture. If the project proceeded and inevitably collapsed under its own impossible debt weight, the corporate veil of Hawthorne Ridge Restoration would be pierced. And because of the forged member resolution he had tried to slip into the system, the cascading financial failure would not stop at the business accounts. The legal liability was explicitly designed to bypass him and route directly to the majority shareholder. It was not just a risky investment he hoped would pay off. Mariners Row was a deliberately engineered trapdoor. He knew the soil was bad. He knew the zoning would fail. He was fully intending to blow up the project, file for corporate bankruptcy, and let the commercial lenders come after me personally for the millions of dollars in defaulted loans. He was not just trying to steal my past. He had actively designed a mechanism to completely annihilate my future. I closed the laptop, the silence of the farmhouse pressing in around me. The battle was no longer just about protecting my assets from a cheating spouse. It had evolved into a fight for my absolute survival against a man attempting to legally bury me alive. The forensic audit rapidly evolved from a standard financial review into a surgical, merciless dissection of corporate fraud. My private accountant, a man whose resting heart rate never seemed to fluctuate regardless of the numbers he uncovered, presented his final dossier on the Mercer Brand Advisory account late Tuesday afternoon. He did not mince words, nor did he attempt to soften the blow. He definitively categorized every single bill submitted by Sloan Mercer as a sham invoice. They were masterclasses in vague, meaningless corporate jargon, charging us tens of thousands of dollars for items labeled as strategic brand alignment, market synergy evaluations, and target demographic outreach. Yet, when the auditor demanded the corresponding work product, the files were completely empty. There were zero tangible deliverables. There were no campaign reports, no metric analytics, no digital marketing materials, and absolutely no evidence that any actual labor had been performed. It was a phantom vendor. Hawthorne Ridge Restoration had bled hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of 14 months for nothing but empty air. The money had simply marched out the door in a steady, unbroken rhythm directly into her pockets. The audit also illuminated the incredibly dark corners of the Mariners Row development ledger. Declan had aggressively coded dozens of exorbitant luxury expenditures under the broad, unquestionable umbrella of client cultivation. On paper, these transactions were supposedly high-stakes dinners and weekend retreats, designed exclusively to woo major commercial investors for the controversial riverfront development. In reality, the forensic trace on the corporate credit card receipts matched commercial flight manifests and luxury hotel registries perfectly. The client cultivation was nothing more than romantic. Clandestine getaways for my husband and his mistress. He was utilizing our operational cash flow to finance ski trips to Aspen and private beachside villas in Carmel, actively hiding his personal infidelity behind the sanitized veil of aggressive business expansion. But the most damning evidence of his malice came not from the financial ledgers, but from our own internal communication network. Declan believed he had thoroughly and permanently sanitized his digital footprint. He had meticulously deleted his private correspondence with his external legal counsel from his main laptop and the primary office server. However, he completely failed to account for the automated, encrypted cloud backups that mirrored our entire digital architecture every single night at 2 a.m. I pulled the archive logs and retrieved the purged email chains. Reading his unfiltered words was like staring directly into the abyss of a stranger's mind. The emails laid out a methodical, step-by-step strategy to fabricate my explicit consent for the catastrophic commercial loans required to fund Mariners Row. He explicitly instructed his attorney to structure the impending debt so that, in the event of a total project default, the financial liability completely bypassed his newly formed holding companies and crashed entirely onto my personal net worth. He was constructing a paper trail that made me the sole consenting party to our mutual ruin. The severity of his deception soon expanded far beyond financial manipulation and crossed the line into severe physical negligence. On Thursday morning, a site foreman named Ronan Pike requested a highly confidential meeting. Ronan was a seasoned, tough-as-nails builder who had successfully supervised our largest and most complex residential sites for 8 years. He sat across the desk in my office, his calloused hands nervously turning his yellow hard hat in slow circles, and finally confessed the secret that had been keeping him awake at night. Declan had explicitly ordered him to intentionally falsify the preliminary site surveys for the Mariners Row development. The riverbank soil had spectacularly failed 3 consecutive density tests, severely missing the critical technical milestones required to safely support the proposed foundation of the luxury complex. Ronan had urgently warned him that building on that specific plot of land without a massive, custom-engineered piling system would be structurally disastrous and potentially lethal. Declan had aggressively ordered Ronan to keep his mouth shut, demanding that the site be marketed to potential investors as perfectly stable and ready for immediate excavation. He was actively selling a highly dangerous illusion just to secure his initial funding. Listening to Ronan speak, the entire strategic landscape of my battle shifted. I understood with absolute clarity that if I merely proved my husband was sleeping with another woman, I would easily secure the moral high ground in a civil divorce proceeding. A family court judge might grant me a slightly more favorable alimony settlement based on his poor personal conduct. But that was a small, entirely emotional victory, proving that he was actively engaged in corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and severe structural negligence was an entirely different arena. That was not about winning public sympathy. That was about entirely annihilating his power structure. I did not want to be remembered as the wronged wife. I wanted to execute a flawless corporate takeover. The sheer weight of this incoming legal avalanche did not go unnoticed by the younger woman he had chosen to replace me. Sloane Mercer was finally waking up to the terrifying reality of the man she had anchored herself to. She had recently learned, through the sudden freezing of all their lavish accounts, that Declan did not actually own the controlling stake of the construction company. She discovered that he held zero leverage over the family farmhouse. And most terrifyingly, she realized that the financial crimes he had committed were actively utilizing her name and her registered business entity. He had set her up perfectly to be the ultimate financial scapegoat. If the federal tax authorities or the civil courts started asking aggressive questions about the missing company funds, the paper trail led directly to her front door as an independent consultant. She was holding the bag for his embezzlement. Desperation breeds incredibly strange alliances. Late Friday afternoon, my attorney received a highly confidential communication from the legal counsel representing Sloane Mercer. The woman who had actively helped dismantle my marriage was now officially offering a limited cooperation agreement. She was willing to provide verified, sworn affidavits confirming that she had never provided any actual consulting services to Hawthorne Ridge Restoration. Furthermore, she offered to explicitly detail how Declan had instructed her to submit the fraudulent invoices to funnel the stolen cash. In exchange, she wanted an ironclad guarantee that I would not name her as a primary co-defendant in my impending civil lawsuits against him. I felt absolutely zero sympathy for her predicament. I did not trust a single word that came out of her mouth, and I despised the transactional nature of her sudden honesty. However, a verified, legally binding statement from his own co-conspirator was a powerful piece of evidence I could not afford to ignore. I instructed my lawyer to accept the limited affidavit. I was more than willing to let her save herself by bearing him under oath. The final, sickening piece of the puzzle arrived over the weekend. The forensic information technology specialist I had retained successfully decrypted a deleted packet of text messages exchanged between Declan and his private attorney exactly 2 weeks before our 25th anniversary. I sat alone at my kitchen counter and read the digital conversation that outlined my intended execution. Declan had specifically and purposefully chosen the date and the intimate setting of our anniversary dinner to drop the bomb. His lawyer had warned him that the separation agreements were highly aggressive and severely favored him financially, noting that any competent opposing counsel would immediately contest them. Declan's response to his lawyer was chilling. He wrote that the sheer emotional shock of announcing the divorce right at the dinner table directly in front of Willa and Jude, would induce a state of complete psychological paralysis. He calculated that the sudden public humiliation would force me into a desperate, weeping panic to end the confrontation. He absolutely guaranteed his lawyer that I would quickly sign the temporary asset separation papers just to get him out of the house, ensuring the ink was dry before I ever had the chance to read the fine print or consult an attorney. I set the printed transcript of those messages down on the cold marble island. The absolute, undeniable truth settled into my bones. Declan was not simply a man who had cowardly fallen out of love and made a selfish, cliché choice. He was a predator who had meticulously weaponized the most sacred ritual of our family life. He had looked at a milestone that was supposed to celebrate 25 years of partnership and saw nothing but a tactical opportunity for severe legal coercion. He intended to use the deep trauma of his own children as a theatrical distraction to execute a financial robbery. He truly believed he was playing a brilliant game of chess against an emotionally fragile, unsuspecting opponent. He had absolutely no idea he had already been playing on a board I completely controlled. His high-priced litigator immediately pivoted away from defending the financial discrepancies and launched a full-scale assault on my character. They filed a lengthy, aggressive brief arguing that I had spent an entire year quietly constructing a malicious trap. They characterized the foundational appendix from 2009 as an obsolete, irrelevant relic of a bygone financial era that held no practical weight in modern operations. The narrative they desperately tried to spin was that I was a bitter, aging spouse attempting to execute a hostile, entirely illegal corporate hijacking purely out of romantic jealousy. Declan knew he was losing the paper war, so he attempted to manipulate the one vulnerability he thought I still possessed. He invited Jude to a quiet lunch at an upscale downtown restaurant, reverting to the exact manipulative tactics he had used his entire life whenever he needed someone else to clean up his colossal messes. Jude came to the farmhouse later that evening. He looked entirely hollowed out, carrying the immense weight of a young man who was being forced to parent his own father. He stood in the kitchen, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "He says you are destroying the family legacy," Jude said, his voice thick with exhaustion. "He told me that if you keep pushing this suspension, the banks will panic. They will pull our credit lines, and the entire company will completely collapse. He wants me to ask you to back down and settle this quietly." I watched my son waver. I knew he did not fully believe his father's sudden display of victimhood, but Jude was deeply terrified. He was afraid of losing the single tangible achievement that had always made our family proud. He was terrified that the enterprise he had grown up admiring was about to be burned to ash in a bitter, public divorce battle. I did not try to sway him with tears or demands. Instead, I walked into my home office, retrieved my laptop, and set it on the kitchen island. Then I opened the encrypted folder. "Sit down," I told him gently. I walked him through the pristine, chronological timeline. I showed him the fabricated marketing invoices. I opened the digital logs that proved his father had altered legally binding documents in the middle of the night. Finally, I opened the most damning piece of evidence. I showed him the intercepted email to the external counsel. I pointed to the glowing screen, allowing Jude to read his father's exact, unfiltered words. "Avery will not have time to understand what is happening until all the paperwork is completely finished," Jude read aloud, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. I closed the laptop. The brief flicker of doubt in Jude's eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened understanding. He realized in that instant that his father was not trying to save a family legacy. He was desperately trying to use his own son to protect his stolen money. Willa, entirely unlike her brother, possessed a fierce, volatile protective reflex. When she learned about the aggressive smear campaign his lawyers were orchestrating in the court filings, she was ready to go to absolute war. She wanted to march down to his newly rented apartment, confront him face to face, and broadcast his financial crimes across every social media platform she possessed. I had to physically block the front door to stop her from leaving the house. "You cannot do this," I told her, gripping her shoulders firmly. "If you scream at him, If you send a single threatening text message, his lawyers will immediately attach it to their legal filings. They will use your anger to prove their false narrative that we are acting out of pure, irrational malice. Do not hand them the exact weapon they need to defeat us. You have to hold it in. She glared at me, her chest heaving with exertion. But the strict legal training she was receiving in her classes eventually overrode her fury. She nodded sharply, swallowing her rage, finally understanding that a sudden emotional explosion would instantly shatter our strategic advantage, while I was successfully managing the psychological warfare at home. The structural foundation of my plan suffered a sudden, terrifying tremor. Leland Voss, the minority shareholder whose proxy I desperately needed to guarantee a unified front at the impending board meeting, began to get cold feet. He called me early on a Thursday morning, his tone deeply anxious. The commercial market absolutely despises noise, Leland warned over the phone. Declan is threatening a scorched earth litigation strategy if this turns into a prolonged, highly public scandal. The major clients will flee. We might need to negotiate a quiet buyout and let him walk away with a portion of the maritime project just to save the core brand. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs. I legally held 52% of the voting power. But moving forward, without the absolute consensus of the minority investors, would inevitably invite secondary shareholder lawsuits and severely damage the optics of the corporate transition. I was a fraction of an inch away from losing the crucial block of support that legitimized my authority to the outside world. I told Leland I needed exactly 24 hours before making a final, disastrous concession. That same afternoon, the delivery arrived. A bonded courier knocked on the front door and handed me a thick, sealed envelope from Sloan Mercer's legal team. I opened it at the dining room table. It contained her fully authenticated, sworn affidavit, bearing the official stamp of a state notary. Attached to her written testimony was a secondary stack of supplementary wire transfer receipts from her own banking institution, perfectly matching the stolen funds from our corporate accounts. It was the definitive kill shot. It transformed lingering suspicions and circumstantial theories into concrete, admissible evidence of corporate fraud. I immediately scanned the entire packet and transmitted it through a secure, encrypted portal directly to Leland. He called me back exactly 12 minutes later. There will be absolutely no settlements, Leland stated firmly, his previous anxiety entirely erased by the undeniable proof of the massive theft. We cut him out completely. The following Monday morning, I walked up the wide marble steps of the county courthouse for the temporary injunction hearing, which would immediately precede the decisive emergency members' meeting. I did not walk into that monumental building carrying the heavy, humiliating posture of an abandoned wife. I walked with the straight spine and the absolute, unwavering focus of a senior corporate partner who was actively protecting her assets, her dedicated employees, and the undeniable truth. I entered the private conference room adjacent to the judge's chambers. Declan was already seated at the long oak table, flanked by his legal team. He was wearing his sharpest tailored suit, his hair perfectly styled. When I walked through the heavy wooden door, he adjusted his expensive silk tie and offered a small, highly confident smirk. He still firmly believed he was the smartest person in the entire building. He still thought he could effortlessly out-talk the severe allegations, skillfully shift the ultimate blame onto my supposed administrative incompetence, and completely charm the mediators just as he had successfully charmed wealthy clients for over 2 decades. He was actively preparing to deliver the grand performance of his lifetime. I sat down directly across from him, placed my heavy leather briefcase on the polished wood, and neatly folded my hands. He thought the room was waiting for a charismatic, soaring speech. He had absolutely no idea that rooms exactly like this one never listen to smooth, empty words. They only bow to the one specific thing I had brought with me. I brought the undeniable, inescapable mountain of documented reality. The mediator, a retired circuit judge with zero tolerance for theatrics, called the room to order. Declan's attorney immediately launched into his prepared monologue, painting a picture of a successful patriarch under siege by a bitter, vindictive spouse. I let him speak for exactly 10 minutes before I opened my briefcase. I did not raise my voice, nor did I interrupt his grand performance with a single objection. I simply slid the bound forensic dossier across the polished oak table, followed immediately by the bank confirmation letters and the certified system logs. "What you are looking at," my attorney stated, speaking for the first time that morning, "is irrefutable proof of severe corporate malfeasance, wire fraud, and the gross misappropriation of company assets." I placed the final document on top of the pile. It was the sworn affidavit from Sloan Mercer, complete with her corresponding bank transfer receipts. Declan leaned forward, his eyes desperately scanning the notary stamp on his mistress's testimony. The color drained from his face so rapidly he looked physically ill. The charismatic armor he had worn his entire adult life shattered right there in the sterile light of the courthouse conference room. His attorney stopped speaking mid-sentence, staring at the financial records with the horrified realization that his client had lied to him about absolutely everything. The injunction hearing seamlessly transitioned into the emergency meeting of the corporate members of Hawthorne Ridge Restoration. Leland Voss sat at the far end of the table, his hands folded neatly over his silver cane. When Declan desperately attempted to argue that my controlling share was a forgotten technicality that held no weight in modern operations, Leland silenced him with a single, sharp look. "I was in the room when that appendix was drafted," Leland said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "I remember the exact day Avery liquidated her personal safety net to save this enterprise from total bankruptcy. That 52% voting right is entirely valid. It was never canceled, and it was never replaced. She holds the majority, and she has my absolute support, with the majority vote permanently secured. I formally invoke the removal for self-dealing clause embedded deep within our operating agreement, because my forensic accountant had meticulously documented the exact financial damage. The removal was immediate and legally incontestable. Furthermore, the contract stipulated a highly punitive buyback formula for any member terminated under this specific clause. Declan was not going to walk away with half the value of the thriving company he had marketed to the world. His compromised equity was valued at a severely discounted rate, stripped of all future earning projections, leaving him with a tiny fraction of what he had arrogantly assumed he would carry into his new life. With my authority fully restored, my first official act as the undisputed managing member was to completely freeze the Mariners Row development. I ordered an immediate internal investigation and formally withdrew our letter of intent from the commercial lenders. Because I had successfully intercepted his backdated resolution, the corporate liability remained strictly isolated. The family farmhouse was entirely insulated from his reckless ambition. He could not touch a single wooden beam of my sanctuary. The subsequent divorce settlement was incredibly swift and brutally one-sided. In the state of Ohio, the deliberate dissipation of marital assets is severely penalized. Because I had proven he was actively funneling our shared wealth to a mistress and attempting to hide massive financial liabilities under my name, he lost every single point of leverage. I retained absolute ownership of the renovated farmhouse and complete, unencumbered control of Hawthorne Ridge Restoration. He was forced to move into a modest apartment, stripped of his title, his reputation, and the financial engine that had funded his arrogance. The ultimate irony of his destruction was not that I had actively set out to ruin him. I did not lay an elaborate, malicious trap. The twist that ultimately broke him was entirely of his own making. Declan did not lose everything because I destroyed him. He lost everything because he built his entire exit strategy on a fatal assumption. He assumed that the woman who had slept beside him, raised his children, and managed his life for 25 years did not understand money, did not understand legal contracts, and most importantly, did not understand him. He believed his own fabricated myth, completely forgetting that I had built far more of his success than he ever understood. Over the next 12 months, I systematically restructured the company. I permanently cut the dangerous, ego-driven riverfront projects. I gathered our core team of builders, foremen, and project managers, and we returned to the foundational work that had originally made us profitable. We focused on high quality, manageable residential restorations with honest margins. The panic that had briefly gripped the warehouse evaporated, replaced by a quiet, steady rhythm of genuine productivity. The company did not need a charismatic frontman. It simply needed a competent architect. Exactly 1 year after the dinner party that ended my marriage, I stood in the kitchen of my farmhouse. The autumn air was crisp, blowing gently through the open window above the copper sink. I was setting the long mahogany dining table for a small, intimate dinner. Willa was arriving from the city, having just passed a brutal round of law school exams, and Jude was driving down from his engineering campus. Both of my children had healed remarkably well, their respect for me anchoring our family tighter than ever before. There were no expensive, unlit beeswax candles on the table. There was no slow-cooked beef designed to evoke a false sense of nostalgia. And there was no rehearsed speech waiting to shatter the evening. There was only the warm, savory smell of roasted chicken and the quiet hum of a house that finally felt entirely safe. I smoothed my hands over the clean linen tablecloth. I looked around the room, feeling the solid, unyielding strength of the floorboards beneath my feet. I was a 48-year-old woman who did not require anyone's permission to exist, to lead, or to thrive. The greatest truth of my life resonated in the absolute stillness of that room. When Declan raised his glass a year ago, he truly believed he was leaving me behind to claim his ultimate power. He never realized that on that night. He simply walked himself right out the front door, abandoning everything I had silently and flawlessly held together for him for 25 years. He left with nothing, and I kept the entire world. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please leave a comment down below and let me know where you are tuning in from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next upload.